I, Peter J. Polack, MD, will be interviewing Peter J. Polack, PhD, my son, who has a master's degree in artificial intelligence from Georgia Tech and a PhD in information studies from UCLA. His area of expertise is in algorithms and visualization, and most recently did work in forensic architecture using satellite imagery and 3D computer analysis to investigate war crimes. He's now exploring the synthesis of art and visualization while a resident at the Berlin Program for Artists. Here now is the interview. Okay, so let's start with this. What is the state of generative AI?
Generative AI has existed, I think, for around maybe like 5 years in a way that people have been using it pretty regularly. It was maybe like 5-6 years ago that I made a video game with generative AI. At the time, it was really exciting, even though it was pretty bad quality. And now it's a situation where they're fine-tuning the models to such an extent that you can really nail in the specific things that you want to show with like text and images and all things like this. Yeah.
Are they getting better or worse?
For sure, it's getting absolutely better to the point that I keep being impressed by it over the years. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about drift and hallucinations. So what are they and what is the impact of these? We've been seeing some of this using some of the LLMs that they seem to be kind of going off topic, off course, drift, and then hallucinations where they're actually just making up stuff.
Yeah, so since the algorithms and the models are trained off of existing data, then when you're trying to generate something specific, they could use anything from that existing data that they're trained on to make that generated thing. So potentially, if you try to generate one thing, it might use anything else from that data that it's trained on that goes into that generated thing that it's trying to produce. So of course, if you're making an image and you want it to generate, say, a train, then it could be the case that something that it takes from the data, from the training data, comes into that image that is not what you expected, an apple or a snake or something like this. So this is the idea of hallucination, which is basically the AI kind of creating something, manifesting something that you didn't necessarily intend for it to do. And that can manifest in all of these strange ways. It can be outside of a typical object. It could be something much more unusual. And this idea of drift is basically that since these AIs are trained on existing training data, and that data is being continuously updated, it could be the case that the more content that's being produced, including content that's made by AI, could be then fed back into the new algorithms and the new models, pushing them to produce content that's not ideal or not as precise as before. But generally, there's a bit of a difference between maybe just a model that's working in a naive way that is basically just put out there for anybody to use, and some of these models that are developed and maintained by services and companies like OpenAI or Midjourney, where they're really working to fine-tune the models and correct for these things.
Yeah, I didn't think about the fact that since so much content is now being produced by AI, that it's almost like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
So talking about training databases and sources, so most of the LLMs are using data that's a couple of years old. So why not use like Google Gemini, since it's pretty much always up to date?
So in that, I mean, there's a term that's in machine learning and developing algorithms that there's no free lunch. And the idea is basically that no matter how good you make an algorithm, it's always going to have certain types of limitations. Maybe you manage to make an algorithm faster, but then it comes at the expense of it can only work with certain specific problems. So in general, with whatever you're choosing, because a model is supposed to fit to a certain use case, you're always going to make some kind of trade-off. So maybe the models that are more focused on more recent data, I guess in this case, maybe they're not as robust, for example. Maybe they haven't been, checked over time, where in comparison to the old models, they might be more refined, for example. Yeah.
So AI companies are talking a lot now about capability overhang, that the models have become too complicated for users and businesses, and that even developers are saying that the work they're doing is become more difficult because they can't understand the underlying models. Do you think this is something that's real?
It's definitely always been the case that when we're working with these machine learning models, especially neural networks and algorithms like this, they involve such a complex level of information and amount of information, and the way that that information gets processed into these computational neurons is very obscure for a person to be able to understand. So there's always been this level of obfuscation and this difficulty to just open up the algorithms and understand what they're doing. And of course, this is generally becoming more and more severe, more exacerbated by developing more sophisticated models that have more pieces and elements. I think if you take any modern LLM, like in ChatGPT, or any algorithms that are used by Midjourney, they're going to be a composition of multiple algorithms and models coming together. So the level of sophistication is pretty advanced. And to be able to track down specifically why a model made a specific decision is going to be difficult, and arguably more and more difficult. At the same time, I don't know specifically why they would say that it's harder for developers to understand what's going on, or harder for developers to make use of the model, because that doesn't really seem like an aspect that comes into play when you're actually using the model. For most users and things like this, that's not something that you would actually have to worry about. But maybe if they mean people who are actually developing the models themselves, then yeah, certainly I think when you're coming up against these compositions of models, it's a lot for like one person to deal with. Yeah.
Medical practices, that's what we're working with, is on the marketing side, they have to develop patient education content that has to be accurate. And so how do we think about augmenting humans with AI? What should you expect in order to use it the right way? Should we be thinking like a scientist or like an engineer? What do you think is the best model for how the user should work with these tools?
Maybe you have to think a little bit like a statistician, because all of these models are working probabilistically. So it seems to be the case that maybe you have a model that's helping answer questions or helping educate your clients, and maybe that model is working like 99.5% of the time. Maybe there's a 0.5% where it gives something that's like slightly strange, just because it's always probabilistically possible that something like this would happen. So it seems like in this case, the best thing you could say is, as they normally do with these models, make sure to verify all answers. So for generally, in most cases, these models are going to be, helping give some basic information, especially if it's information that's already codified, already known, already present in the training data. Of course, when you get to more obscure edge cases, then you have these things that might come up out of probability. Yeah.
So a little bit a different topic here. Energy prices are predicted to continue to increase sharply, in part fueled by AI data centers. And a lot of this is being passed on to the consumers, who arguably may gain little benefit from these data centers. So what's the impact of data centers on energy and water? You're actually doing research on this, correct?
Yeah, so right now I'm working to map some of the environmental harms and the load of data centers on the energy grid and on the environment, and the way that data center development works with zoning, things like this, where they develop data centers and which communities. And I think there was one article that came out recently that said the kind of the CO2 impact of data centers is now comparable to all of the CO2 emissions from the city of New York. And that's, of course, going to increase more and more. And that's just one aspect of this environmental impact. And for sure, in my own work, since I'm programming and also using these LLMs with programming, I'm starting to see how the cost of using these models is starting to slowly increase. And sometimes the quality of the models is being titrated down slowly. So as a developer, if I'm making a certain amount of money from coding, and then I use a small percentage of that for these like AI assisted coders, I'm starting to see how that's actually starting to take a chunk of my paycheck. So of course we can imagine that for these services to be profitable, slowly they will charge more. And also the greater toll they take on the environment, it might not be a type of resource that is infinite, basically. Yeah.
So they were making them free or cheap to get everyone hooked on them. And now they're realizing that they're going to have to start making money. So they're gradually increasing the cost and titrating the quality down unless you pay more for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as to give an example, I was often using Claude's LLM to code, which was pretty effective. And then they made with the service that I use, which is run by GitHub, or these services run by Microsoft. Then recently they made Claude in a premium version only. So I'm actually already paying a subscription to be able to use the models, but now to be able to use these Claude models, I have to pay an additional amount for premium models. So there's all these tiers of which models are premium and which are actually free. And I found that lately the free models like ChatGPT are just causing a mess out of the code. Even asking it to do something very simple, it's just causing like absolute spaghetti out of my code and breaking things. And that's not something that I had really noticed before. So this is anecdotal, but it seems like in many cases there's some adjustments that are happening with the models, or maybe when they release a new version, then they're making some changes to the older version. I'm not sure exactly how that's working, but I noticed that using existing models that I was using before, it's now causing problems. Yeah.
Wow. All right, different question here now. Is artificial general intelligence, so for people who aren't familiar with that, AGI, that's a super aware AI that can actually think, that truly passes the Turing test. Is this a pipe dream?
Well, I mean, I think there already exists artificial intelligence that can pass the Turing test, because the Turing test is just trying to identify intelligence according to whether or not an agent, a computer program, can mimic a human entity. So there were chatbots that have passed the Turing test in that sense. Now, for some more advanced type of intelligence, which is able to solve problems and really think about the way that different things relate together, going beyond even only the training data that's given to it. This always has seemed to me as something that's theoretically possible to do, theoretically possible to implement, but not something that is very likely given the types of incentives that we have in the world. And to give an example of this, we have now these large language models, LLMs, like ChatGPT, that are creating these answers and doing this reasoning that's working probabilistically, looking at the probability between different words and then creating sentences from those probabilities, basically. And this has created something that everybody is very interested in and is doing certain things in the world, and there's a huge incentive for using the services, but it's not something that can suddenly lead to intelligence by just giving it more data. It's something that you would have to take a step back, stop developing in that particular direction, and create a new way of thinking about these models. There is definitely a hope or an expectation or a possibility that just by feeding these types of models more and more data, that eventually they could break through to some type of intelligence, but this doesn't seem very likely, given that these models work basically probabilistically, looking at existing relationships between language alone. They're basically working superficially, if you can think about it like that, looking at the relationships between words instead of the meaning of the words, let alone the meaning of the objects that the words refer to. So if these entities are able to go to those deeper levels of meaning beyond like the superficial level of words, then something like intelligence could be possible. And I'm sure there are many people working at that. Other than that, it's probably not a good idea for anybody to try to make very decisive predictions about what can happen with these systems, because I'm sure anybody trying to predict 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what could happen exactly would be probably proven wrong. It's very difficult to predict.
So there's so much money being made with these models that the genie's out of the bottle, and they would have to really go in a totally different direction to actually achieve that true intelligence.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me, to try to imagine what is the incentive of creating a more sophisticated intelligence when we already have a kind of superficial intelligence that can do many of these tasks already. I think it seems a bit like it's a philosophical question also, because while you could maybe get these automated systems that are able to reason or pull information from the internet that's able to answer questions, they would not really be able to create something new that hasn't really existed before. There's a kind of threshold that they would have to pass to be able to create something entirely novel. So we might have some type of intelligence under this model, but it's a very specific type of intelligence.
Are you of the camp that AI is detrimental to humanity or beneficial or neutral?
I think I tend to think about AI in the way that we have it now as generally detrimental because it's fueled so much by these market incentives of wanting certain types of services that give people maybe the convenience of immediate access to information in ways that we already had, but it's just making it maybe more convenient. Or this is not to say that these systems don't do anything good. They also generate these for example, maybe there's certain applications in the sciences or in medicine where these specific types of systems are able to create new like answers and solutions. But probably the vast majority, maybe like the 99% uses of these systems is maybe out of control based on the market incentives. And that's also not to say that they are pointless or not adding convenience. I think the reality is that we basically, given the world that we have and the resources that we have, we basically have to make compromises and sacrifices at a certain point. So it's always a question of what do we need to survive? Maybe it's a very like austere or cynical view of the future, but it's a question about what do we actually need to survive, and how AI fits into that in like the ranking of the most critical things for life is at the moment pretty low. Yeah.
Is it an existential threat to humanity?
It's an existential threat only insofar as these like market incentives are an existential threat, where if there's so much investment in data centers, for example, without any regard for the effect that it's having on the environment, then that poses an existential threat. I think it's a way more mundane existential threat than these systems becoming intelligent in themselves. There is also the threat of these systems because basically they are authorized to make actions happen. This can also be generally a threat where you can have one model that's, if it's authorized to, interact with other computers and it has built into it systems for looking at the types of vulnerabilities that networks have, then it can be used, or it can itself, without any intentional use of it, it can automatically hack systems. So that's already been something that's starting to be seen. So there is this threat because these systems can automatically do things and there isn't that intentionality behind them. Yeah.
Are we living in a virtual reality?
No, I would say that we're definitely not living in a virtual reality, and that even if we are, it doesn't really help us to deal with the problems that we face, basically. And that it does seem that for the most part, those people who advocate the idea of us living in a virtual reality have very specific incentives for making that argument. People like Elon Musk, who are saying that we're in a simulation or creating these specific type of fantastical scenarios, they also have an incentive to have people buy into the idea that everything can be simulated, that reality could be simulated, and that we need to invest more specifically into simulations and models in order to be on the same level as reality. Yeah.
Back to reality then. So what's the one takeaway for the average mortal who wants to work more efficiently but also accurately with AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's always good to keep an eye on the way that the tools are evolving, because like I said, all of a sudden the rug can be swept out from under you, where suddenly you're using a free service and then you're having to pay for it. And then also on a more macro level, keeping an eye on what is actually happening with the extent of data centers probably because of the scale that they're developing at, there will be some kind of regulation towards them. So I think the most important thing is maybe recognizing that what's happening isn't really static. It's changing very fast. The cost of the services is changing pretty rapidly. The capabilities are changing. It's really unclear whether there will be like a breakthrough for some higher form of reasoning, but there will surely be changes in what these models are capable of doing. So it seems more like keeping an eye on how it's developing. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah.